Covalent bonds. What are covalent bonds? It is a bond in which electrons of atoms are shared by the atoms that are involved. So electrons are shared, as opposed to ionic bonds where electrons are completely transferred or received because electronegativities are so far apart. So for covalent bonds that are sharing electrons, they form because electronegativities are relatively closer than in ionic bonding. This usually happens, covalent bonding usually happens between non-metals. So the non-metals usually combine because they have electronegativities that are very close to each other, and they represent the covalent bonding, the sharing of electrons. So let's take, for example, Cl2, a diatomic element. So Cl has there's two atoms of Cl in this molecule. So I'm going to use Lewis dot structures to represent the number of valence electrons that each Cl has and why they would decide to share electrons. So Cl has 7 valence electrons. So I'm going to draw those 7 valence electrons, each of the dots representing an electron. And so this has 7 valence electrons, and the other atom of Cl also has 7 valence electrons. Now we know that bonding occurs so that the atoms can become more stable. And to be stable, they want 8 valence electrons in their valence electron shell. So we want 8 valence electrons, not just 7. So what happens is they start to share these 2 electrons so that they have 8. So if they're sharing, that means they still get that 8, they still get the happiness of having the 8, but they're actually both still have 7, but they're sharing the 8th electron. They're sharing that 8th electron that they need. So if I draw them closer together, this is where the sharing is happening, right here, the Cl here. They might have those other valence electrons floating around, but that's where the sharing is happening. It's sharing those 2 electrons, and they're floating around in the same vicinity of the both atoms. And we usually draw this with a line. This line represents that there are 2 electrons being shared. And this is why atoms would come together to form covalent bonds and share electrons rather than transferring them, because of their electronegativities and because of the fact that they want 8 valence electrons. Remember, nonmetals are usually the ones that are doing this type of bonding. Now, there are covalent compounds, compounds that only contain covalent bonds. And this is going to become important for when we discuss certain types of compounds and why they have certain properties because of their covalent bonds. Now, there are 2 types of covalent bonds. The first type are polar covalent bonds. Polar covalent bonds are where electrons spend more time in the vicinity of one atom than the other. Why is this? Because their electronegativities are still close enough to share atoms, but they're a little bit further apart, so one atom is more attractive than the other atoms. So this creates poles. Let's take, for example, H2O, a very common example of a polar covalent bond. There's oxygen, so I'm going to draw an oxygen atom like this, and then I'm going to attach H's to it like this. And based on its shape, it's going to help us to look at why it has poles. So here, oxygen has a higher electronegativity than both these H's. So the electrons are going to be more attracted to the oxygen and spend more time with the oxygen, creating a partially negative charge here. And there's going to be a partial positive charge here because those electrons are leaving the vicinity of the H's to go to the oxygen. And now that they have a partially negative charge and a partially positive charge, they have poles or ends that are partially negative and partially positive, and that's why we call it a polar covalent bond. And electrons are spending more time there. As you can see, though, probably as you can think what's coming up next, there are nonpolar covalent bonds. These bonds These are a covalent bond between elements of the same electronegativity. The atoms do not carry any partial positive or any partial negative charge. So an example of this is the one we used before, Cl2. Cl, it makes sense, Cl and Cl both have the same electronegativity. So they're going to be able to share very equally their electrons. So you can remember that nonpolar covalent bonds share equally, and polar bonds share unequally. Because remember, they're still covalent, so they're still sharing. And for me, to help me remember that it's covalent bonds involve sharing, I think of the prefix co, which tells me like cooperation or cooperative. When I think of that, that means we're working together and we're sharing our knowledge. And that's the first part, and valent stands for the valence electrons. So they're sharing their valence electrons. So remember that covalent bonding usually happens between nonmetals. They involve the sharing of electrons. There are two types, polar and nonpolar. Polar involves sharing unequally. Nonpolar involves sharing equally. And there are compounds that are made and contain only covalent bonds.